I'll be reading Acts 17, 24 and 25. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things.
Good morning. Have you ever been relieved to find out that you're not the only one that struggles with a concept or something about life? I remember growing up, I thought that taxes were like the most complicated thing in the entire world, and I thought I was one of the few people that struggled with the understanding of how you're supposed to even go about doing them. And it turns out, as I got into college, this is just one of those things I worried about in entering into, the adult world, that this was just going to be impossible for me. And as I got into college, there were so many guys in class with me that we got into this class called Preacher and His Work, and it was like the preacher and his taxes, and this is how all it works. And I looked around and I saw every guy that was my age with this blank look on his face, like had this hard time understanding it, had no idea what was going on. And instead of being more afraid that nobody knew what was going on, I was relieved to know that nobody knows what's going on. So if I'm going to prison, I'm going to prison with all my other preaching buddies who never paid their taxes. But there's a lot of things like that that have happened in life where I thought I'm the only one that struggles with this concept or this thing about life. I was on an airplane once when I was younger, and as we were taking off, I had to be about 13 years old, but I heard a guy in front of me, very honest, very humble, but he said, I really hate the landings on airplanes, and so to act like I'm not scared, sometimes I just talk, and I just start talking, I start trying to tell jokes, and I start trying to smile, and I act like everything's fine. And it stuck with me because I was like, that's how I am sometimes. When I'm scared, when I'm nervous, I'll just start to ramble, and I'll just start to try and be sarcastic or make jokes. Every time I'm in the hospital, that's what happens. When a nurse comes in the room, not Janelle, I'll just start rambling because I'm nervous. Yesterday, we did something for the first time, I think. It is the Farley food drive that we had. And there was this sense of adrenaline, I guess, as each car would roll up, and you're like, how is this going to go? What are these people going to be like? What are they going to say? And I was so relieved when I got back inside, people saying, this is exciting, but it's also really nerve-wracking when someone rolls up and you don't know what to say to them. I'm like, okay, good. I'm not the only one that's having a hard time figuring out what's going to happen when they pull up. And it was very interesting to see the different kinds of people, the different conversations that happen. There's no script. I mean, they don't roll up and you just give them this canned speech about what we're doing here. I mean, it's like you just have to roll up with whatever they're going to tell you about their life or what's going on, and you kind of just have to play off what they're going to say and where they're at in their own life. When you look in the book of Acts, they say it's the book of Acts is the beginning of the church. It's a book all about the church. And we know that the church is all about people, and so when you go through the book of Acts, it's no surprise and it's no wonder that you have all of these different interactions with people that are very similar to what we have going on today. If you just read through some of the chapters, in fact, in some of the very same chapters that you read in the book of Acts, you have some people who are very mad and upset with Paul and with Barnabas and with the other missionaries that are trying to convert them and to teach them the gospel. They're extremely mad. Some of them are just kind of mildly interested. They'll tell them about the gospel and say, yeah, well, we'll hear more about this later. Maybe not. And then you have the few and the some in there that are actually interested in what they have to say. And this was not even a part of this lesson yesterday until after the food drive. I started reading through the text that we have, which is Acts 17. If you're interested, you can go ahead and open up to that if you want. Acts chapter 17. But I started reading down through this chapter, and as I was reading down through it, the food drive just kept on coming up in my head. I'm like, people have been the same for a long time. People have thought the same way about the gospel. People have responded to the gospel in the same way for a very long time, or the church, or someone religious. So you have Paul when he goes on Mars Hill, and he is a religious person. They're religious too, but they know that he is a religious person because they invite him to come and talk to them. But as he's on his way up, it's like some of them will hear more about what he has to say. Some of them don't want to do with anything that he has to tell them. And then some of them actually follow him. But it's the same way. You have someone who rolls up to a church building and talks to someone knowing that that person who is going to talk to them at the window is going to be a religious person. And so some of them will try and just kind of shove off. Just when you roll up and they'll say, yeah, okay, thanks, here's the paperwork, here, I'll sign this, whatever, just give me the food. But other people will roll up and they'll start to talk to you about their life. And they'll talk to you about some family member or some friend of theirs that's sick. And as you start to talk with them and you say something along the lines of, is there anything that I can pray for you about? They'll start getting teary-eyed. They'll act like, that's an interesting request. I didn't expect you to ask me that. I just rolled up for some food and now you're talking to me about what you can pray for me about. And you can see that there actually is an interest there. There's a need, there's a gap, there's a hole that needs to be filled by something, and they happen to roll up to the right place. People have been the same for a long time. I want to talk about the needs of God. What does God need, and what does God need from us? You hear that growing up in the church, that God needs you to do something. And if you're like me, that maybe your thought process has been at some point in growing up, what does God possibly need? Put yourself in the position of the Creator for a second. Just the mindset of if you were in that position and you created the entire world and you created all the animals and then you created mankind differently. They could think on their own. They could make their own choices. They could choose to love you or not to love you. They could choose to follow you or not to follow you. And so you create for them in the beginning a paradise, a perfect world for them. And then you expect them to love you because you just gave them all of this. And you gave them a part of yourself. You created them in your own image. They're going to live forever. And then they don't listen to what you have to say. They don't follow you. What would you do? When you think about the God of the Old Testament, some people say he's like this angry God that's just itching to destroy his own creation. And then the New Testament, he's like this loving God who's a little bit more friendly than the God of the Old Testament. But think about that in terms of who God is. If you were watching your own creation reject you, not listen to what you have to say, how would you respond to your own creation? Would you leave them, just kind of back off and let them do their own thing? What would be your response? We say things in the church sometimes like, God needs you to do something. Does God need anything? Does God need for us to do anything at all? If you look in Acts 17, which Jacob read so well for us, verses 24 and 25, those are kind of the key verses that sparked this thought process here. Basically, Paul is trying to educate someone on who God is exactly. And the things that he says about God in 24 and 25 is, God doesn't need for you to do anything for him. God doesn't need you to build him a house because he already has a house. And we know in the book of Ezekiel, you have this prophet who is trying to tell them that the Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And remember, their argument in the book of Ezekiel is, why would God destroy Jerusalem? It's his house. People had this confusion about who God was, but Paul is trying to explain to them, the God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven, does not live in temples made by hand or made by man, 25, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life, breath, everything. Life, breath, and everything. That doesn't leave anything out. So what does God actually need? I want to talk about that word there for a second. The word there for need here is called prosetomai. Prosetomai is the Greek word there that means to request or beg. So when you put it into that context, what Paul is trying to tell these people to educate them about their Creator, the God that made everything, is that God is not going to beg you for anything. That God of heaven is not going to get down on his knees and beg you to do something for him. So if God doesn't need something in that way, if God's not going to beg or request in that way, then what exactly does he need? Or is that just a bad word for it? God doesn't need anything because God doesn't beg, but God does do a few other things in terms for his relationship with us. God desires. God doesn't beg anything from us, but he desires things from us. And we're going to talk about a few of those things and how it relates to people and how our interactions with people. I hope you have your Bibles and you have them opened up to Acts chapter 17, because we're going to stay entirely in this chapter and just look at some of these things about God. God doesn't need because he commands. He commands. In verse 30, he says, the word there is enlightened or overlooked ignorance. He overlooked ignorance for now, but now God is calling all of those to repentance, everyone to repentance. That word there is commands. God has given this worldwide command to every human that is on this planet. So everyone has been given this command, but everyone does not listen to this command, obviously. People have always been the same. And so Paul, talking with these people, is trying to tell them who this God of heaven is. God is not someone who is going to beg you for anything. He's not going to get down on his knees and beg you for something, but God will give you a command because he's God. He's the only one that can give people commands like this. But God doesn't need anything because God gives, in verse 31. So when you just throw out the word commands, that makes God sound more like a drill sergeant or like an army general or something like that. But God is a giver too. In verse 31, notice in the same context, God gave life. Verse 25. It's the precious gift of your very existence. So it sounds like what Paul is saying, if you just look at those two verses, 24 and 25, it sounds like what Paul is trying to tell these people is God doesn't need you. God doesn't want you. He doesn't want anything to do with you because he has everything he needs. He's the creator of the universe. But then when you begin to dissect those verses, he's saying God doesn't need you to build him a house. He doesn't need anything made with your hands. But then in that same line of thinking, he says God has given you everything. The breath of life, your own existence. And that should spark some questions. In talking with people, especially out in the world, when you talk about the God that gave them existence, the question should pop into their mind, why do I exist? What's my purpose? Why am I here? Why did God decide that the world needed me? Why did God decide that the world needed you? What is your purpose? What is your point? You know, there are some people that they spend their entire lives looking for that answer. Why in the world am I here? Some of these things are what we need to keep in mind when people come rolling up to the parking lot, and maybe we just go ahead and judge that as soon as they roll up, they're just here for food. All they want is just some free groceries. That's all they want. Why did God create that person? Why did God create you? We have a purpose. God is the giver of life, our very existence. So it's a precious gift that we have. God is a giver. He's not going to beg for anything. He's not just going to make commands. He's going to give us everything. And he's going to give us everything that we need to succeed. God created us to discover him, to help others discover him. God gave us all things, verse 25. So humans build and discover basically with the bricks that God already gave us. I don't know how many of you played with Legos growing up. But my version of Legos was ignore the instruction manual, just take out all the Legos and build whatever you want. I thought that I had better ideas for what all the pieces that came in the box, and plus the instructions were too hard, I think mainly because I flipped it over and read it either upside down or the Asian instructions that came with them and didn't read the English instructions. But for whatever reason, I decided I was going to make my own thing out of Lego pieces. And what happened, without fail, is I would get to the end of it when I was finished with my project. I mean, I had put it together. It was, a robot or a dragon dog, something. It was not what came in the box, but when it was done, or when I thought it was done, there'd be all these leftover random pieces on the table or on the carpet that were supposed to go on whatever was supposed to be made in that box. But I'd have these random little pieces, and I'd be picking them up like, what do I do with this? And I remember one in particular, it was like a little elephant tusk. It was in Lego elephant tusk, and I'm like, I didn't even know this was an animal. That's not what I built. But you have all these random leftover pieces. But the fact is, I made those pieces out of something that came out of a factory. I mean, someone else made those pieces. They had an intention, a design in mind for those pieces. I'm the one that messed it up when I made my own thing. Everything that we discover in this life, everything that we build, they're all with God's tools. The science books that we have that are supposed to tell us about, where the world came from, and they try and explain it all without God. They've got all the pieces. They're looking around at the entire world, this platform that God gave us, and they're coming up with their own creation, their own design, and it doesn't make sense. Maybe at first when you look at it, you think like, wow, well, science people, they're smart. They've got glasses and white coats. Like, this is amazing. But then as you begin to look into the thought process or the logic or everything that's supposed to be backing this mindset, you go, that doesn't make sense, because where did that matter come from? I mean, the Big Bang Theory, it makes sense at first, but what started that? Some of them go, aliens. You go, okay. If you believe this, we can talk later. But you still have to think, okay, well, where did the aliens come from? That doesn't explain anything at all. But at first, maybe some of these ideas make sense. But what Paul is trying to tell these people on top of Mars Hill is God made everything already. So the tools, the wood, the bronze, the gold that you made these other images out of, these other idols out of, those are God's bricks. God made everything. He made you. He made your entire existence. So everything that you discover and create has already come from this God that I'm trying to tell you about. People need to know why they exist. People need to know what their purpose is. And we need to keep in mind what our purpose is. It's not to judge everyone that rolls up or everyone that we talk to on the street and say, okay, this person is not going to be interested in what God has to say because clearly he just wants something else. He just wants money. He just wants groceries. He just wants something else. That's not our job. It's our job to remember why we're here and why they're here. God created us for a reason. He's a giver of life. But God gave us a place for us to live in verse 26. Everything. So we don't make his home. Paul's point is God made yours. He made us one. The earth is a platform, and this platform is designed to point us to the Creator. Everything. Everything in this world is designed to point us, to direct our minds, our thoughts, our eyes back towards the Creator. Everything is so complicated, but everything is so simple at the same time. Like the concept of the gospel, the message, all of that is simple. But everything to a blade of grass is extremely complicated. But even that has a purpose, to point you back up to the Creator. You pick up a piece of grass and go, man can't make that. Man can't do this. Or, you look at any other animal. I love animals, love to watch the Animal Planet, National Geographic, all that stuff. I'm obsessed with it. But you watch all of these complicated or complex creations that God has made, and all of it is pointing back to God. And somehow some people miss that. And they say, this took years of evolution to evolve and to turn into this whale, or now a whale turned into a cow or a horse, and you're like, what? How are you missing this incredible design and all of this detail that is clearly pointing to a master designer and a creator? How is that being missed? People need to know why they're here and why we're here. God's a giver. God also gave us time, verse 27. God gave us time to look at him, that we might seek him, to handle him. That's that word there that says grope, to touch, to handle, to make, to experience God. Verse 31, to find him. It says he's not far from us. God gave us time. Everything that we have has been given to us by God. But that time that we have is for a reason. Just like our existence, we're here for a reason. The time that God has given us is for a reason. To look for him, to handle him, to find him, to experience God. That's why we're here in this world. To experience our own Creator. God gave us salvation, 31. So all of the gifts that we've talked about so far pale in comparison to that ultimate expression of love, his Son. This is in verse 31. God gave us salvation. Does God need anything? Because what we've just gone through is that God made everything that we see, made our existence, gave us time, gave us salvation itself through his Son. God doesn't need anything. But God does desire something from us. If you look down, starting in the first part of this chapter, verse 17, or chapter 17, you have Thessalonica, then you have Berea, and as you go down and look through all of these different conversations that Paul has with these people, you have Paul in Athens, and then you have Paul the Areopagus. And as you go down, just read through this chapter. I'd encourage you to do this later. Obviously, it is a pretty long chapter, so we're not going to do it here. But I'd like to encourage you to read this chapter when you get home this afternoon. We're not having church this evening, so you have a little bit of time to do this. And just notice all of the different conversations and responses that people have to what Paul is telling them about their own Creator. And it should give you confidence. Because, like I started off with, when you realize that Paul, the great missionary, the great preacher, the one that in the previous chapter was just stoned for his own belief in God. He's gone through all of this. When you see that even Paul is getting these different responses similar to what we get today, I'm interested. I might be interested depending on what you have to say. I'm not interested at all. And maybe I am interested. But you get all those different conversations, and it's so strange that there's this book that's written thousands of years ago, and yet when you're reading it now, you get like this weird deja vu, like, I had a conversation with someone that went very similar to this. But I want you to notice something, keep something in mind as you go through the book of Acts. Paul just keeps going. Have you ever had a bad experience talking with someone about Jesus before, or the church before, and it just got really awkward? Really uncomfortable? It is very easy at that point to be like, hey, maybe I'll just stick with Facebook or text messages. Doing this in person is a little bit uncomfortable. But if you notice that all of the responses that Paul gets, whether they accept the gospel, whether they don't, or whether they're just mildly interested, chapter after chapter after chapter, Paul still goes and talks to everybody who will listen to him. So he gets stoned, persecuted, shipwrecked, starving. He's been thrown into prison several times. He's been beaten several times. And in the very next chapters, you still read about them. Oh, and so then he starts talking to the jailer. Oh, and then he starts talking to the people on the island where he just shipwrecked. Oh, and then Paul starts talking to those same people in the same city that just beat him the day before. You have all of these events leading up to, pointing to something very amazing. The gospel is more powerful than what anybody can do to you. The gospel is more powerful than anything awkward that someone might tell you or any strange conversation you might have. The gospel is more powerful because it's convicting. When we realize exactly what God has given us, what God's done for us, that gift of salvation that we have, it should be pretty hard to keep quiet, even if we have a bad experience. I was very encouraged yesterday about, one, how many cars pulled up, and two, how many people inside those cars were actually willing to talk and give information. And I'm so encouraged by the people that showed up and helped to make that happen, even if you weren't there. We had 25 numbers, emails, and addresses. 25. All those aren't going to work out. I know that. Now, all 25 of those people probably are not going to end up coming here to Farley. But what if one does? And if one does, what's that going to take from us? What does God need from us? What does he desire from us? As you walk down through this chapter, you'll see the kinds of people that Paul talks to, the kinds of people that are willing to open up and listen to what he has to say. If you look in verse 1, God desires us to open up with people, to reason with people, verse 1, to explain to people, verse 3, to give evidences to people, verse 3, to persuade people, verse 4. God desires us to open our eyes to people, those that are of noble minds, verse 11, those that are eager, verse 11, those that will examine, verse 11 again, those that will believe, verse 12. God desires us to open our hearts to people, to be provoked in spirit, verse 16, to be proactive in sight, verse 16, to be prepared to speak, verse 19. The reason Paul was so successful is that when he walked into a room, or when he walked into an area and saw a group of people or saw a person, he was provoked to do something about it. But there are certain kinds of people that will listen. That's those that are willing to examine, those that are of noble minds. But God still desires for us to do the talking. All 25 of those people may not end up here at Farley, but if one of them or one family will end up coming to Farley here, we've got to say something. We've got to actually go and talk to them and reason and examine the scriptures with them and help them. God doesn't need us to do anything, but God has a desire for us. And that's because we serve a God that loves us. God doesn't need us, but he wants us, and he loves us. That's a message that a lot more people need to hear than that are in this room. I hope you're praying about those contacts that we had yesterday, the people that pulled up, and I hope that you're thinking about maybe what you could say to them if they decide to come and visit, or you're willing to go up and actually go to the door and talk with them. I hope you're praying about that, because those are opportunities, open doors that God has just given us and let drive through our parking lot. Let's let God use us. God has a desire for us, and God has a desire for everybody else out in Huntsville. Let's be that voice. Let's help them. And let's help ourselves in the process by doing that and strengthening our own relationship with Christ. If there's something that we can help you with as a church, if we can pray for you, if we can encourage you in any way, if you're struggling in any way, then you always have the opportunity, but this morning is a special opportunity where you can come forward and request prayers of the congregation or put on Christ in baptism. If you have that need, then why not come forward as we stand and as we sing?